Have you ever had that happen to you with a grill? That conversation is true. It's correct. We've been blessed by God has blessed America, and it's also hilarious. But I can't tell you the last time I've had a conversation like that. You know, sitting back and, isn't it wonderful where we are? God bless us. We have so much freedom. The conversations that I've had, at least recently, are a little bit different. And I found a quote on a blog that I wanted to share with you right up here on 4th of July, and I think this is very accurate, really, probably more on line of the type of conversations that we're having, and I think it's a good thing for us to start reflecting on today. This is what the author wrote. He said, the United States, this is on the 4th of July, the United States is 238 years old today, and arguably feeling its age. The country is polarized, but nearly every faction, though for different reasons, distrusts the government. Nearly every faction, also for different reasons, criticizes the culture. The patriotic legends of our history have been replaced with shame about slavery and how white people treated the Indians. The rest of the world seems to have little respect for us anymore. Our intellectual and artistic contributions are dragging. The one bright spot is technology, but we use it mostly for trivial reasons, and it comes at the cost of hacking, identity theft, and privacy violations. Most people would agree that America is very messed up right now. America is in the doldrums. And yet, we love our country in the same way that we love the members of our family. I think this is so true. In spite of their faults, which we know all too well. In fact, a family member's faults and problems properly bring out more love, since we want so badly to help. I see this in conversation. I mean, it's you get into political conversations with people, conversations about culture, and it always comes down to what's wrong with everything, you know. But the anger, the resentment, and frustration that sometimes comes out in these conversations, really at its root has love. We love America, and we want what's best for it, you know? And really the trouble would be, I think it would be problematic really if we stopped being frustrated, and if we stopped being angry, and if we just said whatever. You know, that starts to show that maybe you don't care, but the fact that there is some frustration with the direction of our country and how things are, it shows that there's a lot of love. And what is the frustration? Well, I think you can start by maybe examining the Pledge of Allegiance itself. How many of you said the Pledge of Allegiance when you were younger? Raise your hand, go ahead. Hey, everybody, very good. So you get to the end and it says, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You got used to saying that as a child. Our children today still say that. And there was a time when we got to that part, one nation under God, where you could assume that a lot of people, most people would probably hear that word God and have a similar understanding of God as we do as Christians. Today, it's just not the case. I can even go out into the pews sometimes and get conversations with people, and I wonder if what's going on, how everybody, even in our congregation, sometimes views God. It's just our culture. It's constantly attacking us. I could take that word God, one nation under God, go around my neighborhood. It's not a very big neighborhood. And I'd get people saying things like, well, we should probably remove that from the Pledge of Allegiance. God's, whatever you want him to be. God is this being that created the world and he went away and he doesn't really care about us anymore. You know, God, it doesn't really matter. Well, I think it's important for us to first of all acknowledge that we live in a country that never really was a Christian nation. That's kind of maybe a controversial statement for some, but we never were a Christian nation. The definition of Christian is that that the object of my faith is Christ and his work. And so if you look at our country and how it was built, and the very founding of our country, we were not built on the foundation of Jesus, on the rock of Jesus. Our country wasn't. Our government wasn't built on the foundation of Jesus, okay? And so that's how I can make a statement like that. Our founding fathers, if you start to learn more about them, you just got to take a little history lesson. What you learn is our founding fathers, well, some of them were Christians, a lot of them were deists. They believed that, kind of like I mentioned before, that God is this higher power who came maybe created the world, but now he's far away, distant, and he doesn't really have anything to do with what we're doing right now. We're kind of on our own. Thomas Jefferson is an example of this. I wonder if some of you are familiar with the Jefferson Bible. He opened up a Bible to the Gospels, and he took his scissors and cut out all the statements that talked about Jesus as the Son of God, cut out all the statements that talked about miracles, and what you were left with was the Jesus he thought to be the true Jesus, a very, very good teacher. And so really, if you want to argue, our country really could say was built on Judeo-Christian ethics or principles, but not the rock of Jesus. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. Because that's really the function of government. I can say that even though not everybody would agree on who God is, and people say all sorts of different things about God, I would still say that it is a true statement that we are one nation under God. If you take a look at Romans 13, verse 1, it says this: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." The point is this: God, the only being that has authority in and of himself is God. God has authority because of who God is and what he does. Nobody else has authority in that manner. Everybody who has authority in this world is occupying an office of authority, but that office, that station has been given by God, and that includes our governing authorities. Hope you're tracking me here. So like President Obama and those in Washington, they don't have authority in and of themselves. They have authority because God has placed them in that office. In the same way, you could say that those of you who oversee people, tell other people, you need to do this, managers, perhaps, okay? You don't have authority in and of yourself. It's because you occupy a certain position, an office. The same is true for myself. This is the way I view myself as a pastor. I occupy the office, just as Pastor Miles does. We occupy the office of the pastoral ministry. I don't have authority in and of myself. We don't. That authority comes from God, and one day, someone else will occupy this office. The office is bigger than me, and God is bigger than the office. He gives the power to that office. So hopefully you're understanding what I'm talking about here. That leads to, okay, what is the purpose of government? The purpose of government is to punish evil and reward good. That's the purpose of government. So you have a person existing in this society who says, you know what, I'm going to steal and murder to get things for myself. What does the government do? It says, you go to jail. And in some cases, you get the death penalty. All right? What happens to the person who says, well, you know what, I'm going to risk my life, go overseas and fight in a land I've never been to before to protect the privileges we have here in the United States? What does the government do? Looks at that person and says, we're going to pin a medal on you. The government creates order, okay? It punishes evil and rewards good. And God exercises his authority through the government. All right. Hopefully you have that down so far. So God's an authority over the government, which basically punishes evil, rewards good. The problem is the culture. This is where I struggle sometimes myself, and I'm guessing a lot of you do too, you as well. Because the culture itself, the culture that we live in, is starting to become morally bankrupt. Right and wrong is something that is argued about a lot of times. And culture, what does the culture do? Because we live in a democracy, our culture influences the government, and so that's what causes some of our anxiety and our fear. Earlier this week, you had the Supreme Court ruling for Hobby Lobby, okay? And there was a time in our country where you wouldn't have had to worry about whether private business owners would have to provide certain care for people that could cause abortions. There was a time in our country we wouldn't have to worry about that. We live in a different time and age, and people were worried how that Supreme Court vote would go. And it only passed 5-4, just to give you an idea of where our culture is. And what you have here in our society really is a me-centered world. Everything, my job, is all about me, what I can get for myself, and what kind of empire I can build for myself. The relationships I'm in, those I'm taught by the culture are all about what I can get out of it. You know, if you're not giving me what I want, well, I'm going to move on to somebody else. That includes marriage. You see what the culture teaches us, and this mentality, it's scary. Think about how you're getting drawn into that. In our own congregation, we have people who, I'm guessing some of you may fit into this category, and you see yourselves this way as casual attenders at church. I come a couple times a week, and then a couple times during the month, but other than that, well, I may not have time. What happens is, we come here, you might hear about God's grace, but then you go home and you don't even take God with you. You leave him behind. And so you have those of us who are really sucked in by the culture, and we're brought over here. And then at the same time, there are those of us who fit on the other end of the spectrum. We see those people being dragged on over there. We see the culture as it is. It makes us upset. And what do? We don't love our neighbor. We get angry. We say things that are hurtful. We post things on Facebook. And does that really lead anywhere? Do we ask the question, where are those people at right now in their lives before we address anything? Do we have relationships with the people we're talking to? These are all questions that are to be asked. And so the question is this, how do we as a people, as Christians, how do we influence a culture that is rapidly declining? You can't argue it. You can't argue that our culture is declining. How do you do it? Well, there was a Lutheran pastor named Christian Führer who said this. He was a Lutheran pastor in East Germany when they had a communist, corrupt government over the people. And he said this. He said, "It is not the throne and the altar, but the street and the altar that belong together." What he's saying is that the gospel of Jesus, the good news of God's grace, is not going to change the government. That's not the purpose, okay? The purpose of God's grace is to come down on street level and change individuals. It comes to me in my individual circumstances, in my individual brokenness, and God's grace reminds me that God who sometimes seems distant, he is not distant, he is near and dear to me. He loves me so much that he was given his life for me. That's called unconditional love. And what that does is it transforms me as an individual. It changes the way I look at the people around me. I'm busy oftentimes having conditional love toward my neighbor. What have you done for me lately? You need to conform to my worldview before I learn to love you. Romans 13:8 says this, "Owe no one to anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet," and any other commandments are summed up in this word. "You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." Paul wrote this really as an example of what happens in response to the good news of Jesus. We love our neighbor, and where do we love our neighbor? We love our neighbor in our vocations or our callings. What have you been called to do in this life? Oftentimes, a guy named Martin Luther talked about vocation as a mask of God. And really what this means is that in our vocations, in our callings in this world, loving our neighbor, God is hidden, and he is constantly blessing our neighbor through those callings. In that video you saw earlier, he said, God has blessed America. Well, how has God blessed America? He has blessed America through people who have sacrificed, people who have given their lives so that we might have certain freedoms, people who have made sacrifices for the greater good of their children, for their spouses, for the greater good of our entire country at work. You see what I mean? God works through our callings in life to bless others. God, we don't see God. He's not visible. He is hidden behind these masks that we wear. And these masks we wear, and I should have one more on top, probably starts at church, because at church, that's where we really, God comes and serves us and reminds us how we're loved. It's there that we receive the good news of Jesus and are reminded that no matter how broken this culture is, no matter how broken we are, God does care for us and He loves us. And what happens then in response to that? If you really take a good look at the cross of Jesus, if you really take a good look at what Jesus has done for you, what does that do for you? God Himself pouring out His blood for you so that you might be forgiven. Do I go home then and say, well, I'm not happy with this situation. I need out. Who am I loving? Do I go home and say, you know what? My kids really annoy me. I need new kids. Do I go home and say, man, my wife, my husband, look at all their faults. I'm sure I could do better. No. You go home and you create a culture at home founded on the good news of Jesus. God loved me unconditionally. God knows everything about me. He comes down to me and he says, you are a mess. Just as much of a mess as this country, and I love you anyway. And what does that do to me? It makes me look at my wife. It causes me to look at my 2- and 3-year-olds and my 7-year-old and say, they need my unconditional love. They need me to be there for them. And most of all, the greatest way I can love them is by sharing Jesus with them. It's one of the reasons why every single night at my house, this is what I do every single night. I put a sign on the cross on her forehead and I say, you are a baptized child of God. Remember who you are. I see that as my calling as a parent to constantly remind them that they are defined by Jesus, not by what other people might say. But does our faith, does it stay at home? No. We've been called to do things in this world, to work. We've been called to go to assembly lines and put things together. We've been called to manage people. We've been called to some people have been called to fight overseas, to be willing to sacrifice themselves. And what's the attitude that's brought to all these callings? Do I go to work and say, I'm not making enough? Or do I go to work and do I say, how can I serve my neighbor today? You know, I always think every morning when that garbage collector comes up and takes my trash, I'm like, what would I do without him? What would I have done if if we didn't have people in assembly lines putting in that one part that is so necessary for the car? You know, every time I go to the dealership and I have to spend our $500, I'm reminded of that one part, how important it is. We are serving our neighbor through work. It's a response to the gospel, okay? And at work, think about it this way too. When you make money, where is that money being put in service to? It's being put in service to the home, putting a roof over your children's heads, your own head, providing food. See, this is God hidden at work. And the final thing is stake. Getting back to what I talked about with the government, we are citizens of this country. And what does that mean? That God has blessed me and loved me? Well, that means that I am also called to be subject to the governing authorities. I'm to be aware of what's going on in the news. I'm to pay taxes. And you know what? When it comes time to vote, I don't say I'm too tired to get up. I have too many things to do. No, I get to the voting stations and I vote according to my conscience. You see? Do you see if the gospel has an impact on our lives? Can you see how the culture can be influenced? How we can have an incredible influence on the culture if we're not so self-centered? The gospel draws us out of ourselves. Take another look at Romans 13. This is towards the end. This is a reminder of why we look to our neighbor in love. How we can deal with a world that's not perfect, a nation that's not perfect, and still know that God is in control and He's above us all. Salvation is nearer to us now than we first believed. The night is gone, the day is at hand. Salvation is ours. You know what? No matter how bad things could get, in our country, in our own lives, we are incredibly blessed because God has given us everything that we could need through Jesus. Salvation is ours. One day there will be no more struggles. There will be no more anxiety over what will come because we will be in the presence of Jesus. This past Friday, we had a group from Shepherd Lakes, so we walked in the parade, the 4th of July parade through downtown Brighton, and it was an interesting situation because, in these parades, you see all sorts of different groups. You see political guys, politicians getting out their signs, vote for me, vote for me. You have all the different people expressing their beliefs, their different groups, and here we are in this long parade. Here we have Shepherd of the Lakes. And, as I walked down the parade, I could look at the different people that looked at me, and I could tell that some people didn't know who we were. Some people may be scared that I'm going to, approach them and give them a handout or something like that, But at the same time, I saw lots of people who, called out, "Hey, Pastor!" We had a few people that knew, and it was awesome to see in this community there were people that knew me. And then I heard things like, "Those are our pastors." Heard people saying that, seeing both Pastor Miles and myself out there. And I kept walking, and I saw some people I had gotten to know through Genesis, and they're like, "Hey, Pastor Ben," and I'm like, "Hey, that's pretty cool." Yeah. Got to the end of the parade, and there was, sorry, Ann, I'm going to throw you under the bus, but I saw Ann Colley, and this was an awesome thing to see as well. Obviously, we're handing out VBS flyers, and let's give Ann a VBS flyer, but we had kids giving her hugs. And one after another, after another, after another. What you're seeing is a community, is a culture that we've built here at Shepherd of the Lakes, and it's all built on the gospel of Jesus. And we seek to love one another. And the trick then is how do we as a culture influence the surrounding culture? It starts at home, expands from there. I know that it can sometimes be frustrating living in a country that at times feels like it's falling apart. Just remember that God keeps us grounded through Jesus. Remember that. Christ continues to have an impact on our lives and expands from there. Christ's work is not in vain, and neither is yours. I pray the gospel continue to motivate you to unconditionally love those people around you and to work through what that means, seeking their greatest good. And remember this, that one day, salvation is ours, and one day Jesus will return, and every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess that there is one God, one Savior. Are we one nation under God? Yes, we are. And one day, there will be no doubt about it. For the sake of Jesus, amen.